Where were you and how did you learn that President Biden was dropping out of the race?
I was shopping and I left my phone in my car. And the moment I realized I had done that, I knew this was going to happen during the period in which I was away from my phone.
Oh my gosh. Colby?
So I had been coming off of 5 days of solo parenting, and my husband had gotten home 10 minutes prior.
Honey, I'm home.
I had prepared an afternoon of yoga, and I was going to go get a manicure, and I was just going to really reward myself for parenting alone for 5 days.
And the opposite happened.
And then I worked all night.
We'll get to yoga at some point, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment on this Tuesday, July 23rd. I'm Elahe Izadi, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined today by someone you've heard from before, Colby Itkowitz, who covers voting and elections on the democracy team here at the Washington Post. Hey, Colby.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. Big day.
Yeah, big day. And today we are bringing you an episode of the Campaign Moment and dropping it simultaneously in the Post Reports feed early this week. We normally come to you Friday, and that's because there is so much news to get into. So let's get right into it.
So we're just days out from Sunday's bombshell when President Biden announced that he would no longer be seeking re-election for a second term. And of course, he also threw his support, along with the vast majority of the Democratic Party, behind Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yeah, things were looking bad for Democrats before Biden's announcement. He was trailing Trump in national polls. His brand was such a drain that Democrats were worried about him actually suppressing turnout for their House and Senate candidates. So I think the big question on everyone's mind, particularly for Democrats, is can they pull off a dramatic turnaround with Harris?
Yeah, I think it's clear that Republicans were in a strong position. This is a decision that was born of concern about where the Democratic Party was. They didn't feel like they had much of a shot. And also, it's important to note that both sides are dealing with a new situation here. And judging by some of the comments that we've seen from Republicans, they're not terribly happy that the Democrats pulled off this pretty late switch.
So first, Colby, Aaron and I did want to start with your reporting because you have been following this story and just how quickly it went from will Biden step aside to is Harris the Democratic nominee? And we saw that pass-off happen on Monday when Harris addressed supporters in Delaware in person. President Biden joined by phone as he was recovering from COVID. Let's hear a little bit of that.
Joe is not done. Far from it. He knows there is still more work to do, and our nation will continue to praise his bold and visionary leadership as president. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
And it is my great honor to have Joe's endorsement in this race.
You sure do.
So then just a few hours after that, she secured enough Democratic delegates to lock up the nomination for her party at next month's convention. Colby, how did this happen so quickly?
Yeah, so as soon as the news broke on Sunday, we immediately started calling delegates. Now, there's nearly 4,000 delegates who will officially nominate the party's presidential candidate. The primary creates a presumptive nominee, but it's not official until the delegates vote, usually at the convention. And we had been preparing for this moment, long before Sunday. We had already been in touch with delegates, trying to get a sense of whether or not delegates wanted Biden to drop out. And before Sunday, what we were hearing from delegates is that they were completely committed to the president, that they were going to support the president. But then Sunday happened and he dropped out. So our question was, what now? And the speed in which delegates rallied behind Kamala Harris, I think, has stunned everyone because it happened in 24 hours. States started holding conference calls Sunday night, asking delegates to pledge themselves to the vice president. And almost unanimously in many, many states, they agreed that they were going to get behind Kamala Harris. And she now has enough delegates pledged to her that she will easily sail to the nomination when they make that formal vote.
It has been really remarkable. I'm not going to say that I predicted it happening this quick, but there are a few reasons why I think it did happen this quick. One is that we always knew that passing her over was going to be difficult. The idea that you would go with the not the vice president and not the first female, not the first black vice president was always going to be difficult for Democrats to do, even if they thought that might be the better course. The second thing is that even if Harris might have a low approval rating, which she does, it's not totally clear that there was like a better option out there. There's not a whole lot of candidates with national profiles. A lot of these candidates are kind of 2028 material. A lot of these same names that were talked about for potentially being the nominee are now potential vice presidential running mates. And so we saw a lot of them jump on board with her rather quickly.
Yeah, I do want to ask about that. But even before Colby and Aaron, we get to that, I have this very basic question that I think undergirds why Democrats find themselves in this situation. And my question is she actually better positioned than Biden to win against Trump? Taking into account what you said, Aaron, about, how could they pass over Harris? What is the case for Harris on her own? And is there any good polling on this?
The answer is that we don't have a great sense of where things stand right now because the polling that we have has been in the realm of the hypothetical. I will say she performs only slightly better than Biden was performing. Washington Post polling average has her trailing Trump by 1.5 points nationally versus Biden's 1.9 points. I do think, she is lesser known. She is less of a brand, so there's more room for movement. And I think that's what's appealing to Democrats here. She certainly has a higher ceiling because she is less well known. So while 57% of Americans don't like Biden, it's about 50% for Harris. The other big thing is that if you look at how Democrats in other races across the country are performing right now, a lot of them are doing a lot better than Biden was. I looked at 20 Senate races, the polling in 20 Senate races. The Democrat was running ahead of Biden's margins in 18 of those 20 races.
Wow.
So the country has shown that it is willing to vote for the right kind of Democrat. So there is like this opening for her. It's totally a matter of whether she can seize on that potential opening for her candidacy.
I also think it's important to remember that what we've heard from voters over and over again is that they just wanted another choice. They didn't want either of these two men. They were really unenthusiastic about their choice of Biden versus Trump. And now they have that option. They have someone who's younger, who's very energetic, and the Democrats are excited. I've talked to people at the DCCC, which is the Democratic campaign arm of the House, who says even their down ballot candidates have this renewed energy about them. They feel a lot of hope. Obviously, we saw the fundraising numbers come in for Harris. And so whereas the Democrats were feeling so lackluster and so defeated since the debate, now they suddenly have, again, this renewed fight in them to take on Trump and the Republicans.
And, I wonder, Aaron, about the reliability of any poll that I do see in the coming hours and days because it's happening so fast. Do people even know how they feel?
2 points on this. One is that the earliest polls are going to give very little information on how people are actually perceiving what Harris says on the campaign trail. So it's going to take a little while for the campaign to really set in these polls. I imagine it's going to take until later this week, maybe even 2 weeks to get a real sense for how this race might be shifting. So, I know it's hard to wait. It's hard for me to wait, but we should all kind of be cautious about reading too much into the early polls. People should check out the Washington Post polling averages because there's a nice tool in there that allows you to take the current polls in the swing states and then adjust them for how much the polls were off in past elections. I do think that there is enough information in these polls that we have a sense for where Biden's strengths and weaknesses were and where Kamala Harris might at least be better off or worse off than him in certain areas. And I think that, it's important to always look at these things holistically. Don't look at one poll that confirms what you want it to say or has a little nugget that you think is interesting. If you see a nugget in a poll or a little, a number that kind of interests you, see if it's reflected in other polls as well. And that's what I try to do when I'm writing about polls is like, oh, this is really interesting. What do similar surveys show us about this? And so that's why I think when it comes to where Harris is at in this race right now, there's going to be one early poll and people are going to freak out one way or another. Wait for a few more polls until you really get a sense for whether things have at least shifted in this race somewhat.
And I do think so much of campaigns are about vibes, right? And so
say more vibes.
So, all about the vibes, guys. And so right now the vibes are on Kamala Harris's side. They were not on Joe Biden's side. Are you going to turn out your base? Are people going to be excited to come out and vote for you on Election Day? I've heard people on social media compare this to the energy that was around Obama, in 2008. That's the kind of energy that, women and people of color are feeling about the potential for electing the first woman and the first woman of color to be president. It's hard to capture that in a poll, I think. And so that's what Democrats really have to try to, they've got to bottle that and turn that into votes.
Okay, speaking of vibes, which I now am unabashedly using as a very sophisticated political campaign term.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about those vibes. Kamala Harris says she wanted to earn the nomination and win voters over. What does that look like for her at this point, Colby?
She's got to go out and make the case that she can take on Donald Trump. And what we're hearing already is, listen, I was a prosecutor. He's a felon.
In those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women. Fraudsters who ripped off consumers. Cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
I am a woman. I will support and protect your right to choose. He installed Supreme Court justices who overturned that right. And she could make that argument, that specific argument about reproductive rights, which Democrats have shown is a winning issue, even in red states. She can make that argument a lot better than President Biden ever could. In fact, she's always been kind of the spokesperson in the administration on issues around abortion. And so she really needs to take her strengths. Those are some of her strengths, that she was a prosecutor and that she, is a warrior for women's rights, and make those central to her campaign. They're going to come after her on issues like immigration because, she was...
Yeah, she was put in charge of this idea of address the root causes of migration, and that kind of got all lumped in with the border. Yeah,
Exactly. Again, she's got to play to her strengths. She's young. She's got energy. She's got a big, boisterous Julia Roberts laugh. She's really she's just going to go out there and sell herself, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's the hours since she emerged as the likely nominee and now something amounting to the presumptive nominee have gone about as well as Democrats might have hoped as far as the vibes and the enthusiasm and things like that. Some of that is a cathartic release where Democrats are suddenly moving past this thing that was just looming over them constantly for 3.5 weeks. I think it's worth kind of injecting some skepticism into are their problems all solved right now just because they want to believe they are? And I'm not sure that that's the case yet. There are major questions about whether she can seize on this opportunity. And I think that once we get past this moment of kind of release from Democrats, they're going to start to kind of look more closely at how she performs publicly, the arguments that she makes, how she's being perceived by people. I think it's very much an open question, and the kind of rah-rah moment for Democrats shouldn't obscure the fact that Harris enters this race as a pretty unpopular politician.
Yeah.
And to Erin's point, she ran for president. And flamed out before anyone had even cast a vote. And so...
Yeah, she didn't even make it until 2020. She ended in 19.
Before primaries, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So she has already shown that she kind of struggles in that kind of national campaign. She had a hard time articulating to primary voters why she was the best person to go up against Donald Trump last time. The difference this time is that the message is a lot clearer for her. It is
And
just
she's been
her.
vice president for a while, so there's
Sure.
also that.
Right, right.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the difference between running in a primary and running in a general election. I don't
Yeah.
think that the 2020 campaign is a credit to Harris by any means, but there are different characteristics in a primary. Sometimes it's hard to break through in a primary. Joe Biden in the 2008 primaries also ran, and then by 2020 he was the Democratic nominee and won the presidency. So there is something to be said for the difference in the kind of campaign that you have to run in the primaries, where you're trying to appeal to a small kind of plurality of voters on your side and appealing to a general election electorate.
Well, let's take a pause there because there's a lot more to talk about. We want to get into the nuts and bolts of how the Biden-Harris 2024 campaign is getting remade as Harris and someone else 2024. Plus, we're going to talk about how the GOP is getting ready to attack Harris. We'll be right back. So, guys, I'm curious how much of this decision that Biden made to endorse Kamala Harris came down to what is actually the easiest path, both legally and practically. So what do we know right now, Colby, about her ability to simply take over his campaign and the money that's been raised so far?
I mean, she has, to your point, essentially just taken over his campaign. She's leaving her headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware. She's keeping a lot of his top staff. They kind of took the Biden campaign headquarter Twitter and changed it to Kamala headquarters Twitter. And they're going to just move the money from his campaign committee to her. Her name was on it in the first place. It was always the Biden-Harris campaign committee. And so their argument is that she can take it over. If you had brought in another Democrat who was starting from scratch, they would have been starting at zero. All of those millions of dollars that the Biden-Harris campaign has raised over the last year, they wouldn't have had access to. And so to have a campaign start at $0 with 100 days left to go would have been a steep hill to climb.
Yeah, we're in pretty uncharted territory here in general. So, we're all kind of trying to figure this out on the fly. But this one's pretty clear. Like, she is the one who can take over that money because she was already on the campaign. Republicans, in addition to suggesting they could challenge her being switched in as the nominee for totally unclear reasons, they're not actually talking about specific laws necessarily. They're talking about the idea that maybe this money will need to be refunded to donors according to federal election law. But that same federal election law suggests that even if she can't just directly take this money, it could be transferred to the Democratic National Committee, so it could still be used for her campaign, essentially. So
I am also just wondering about how there is so much that still has to happen in this compressed timeline. I talked to our colleague Tyler Pager about this a little bit on Sunday, and Democrats basically have to do like 5 things all at once for them to pull this off. And on her to-do list is picking a running mate. Do we have any idea of what an expedited vice presidential vetting process could look like?
So Jamie Harrison, the DNC chair, was on Morning Joe this morning and said that he expected her to have a vice president locked down by August 7th, which is when the delegates will have wrapped up voting and making her the official nominee. He said expected, so maybe that's not actually her time frame, but that's what he thought would happen, that they would have a ticket prepared on August 7th to present to states who will then put those names on the ballot that will be presented to voters in November.
Well, Colby, there are a lot of names for potential Harris VP picks floating around. I did want to ask you about one specifically, Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor. I don't know too much about him. What do you think his chances are? What do we all need to know about him right now?
Yeah, so I have known Shapiro since he was a county commissioner in Montgomery County.
Wow.
Yeah, almost, a I guess, more than a decade ago. And so I covered his governor's race very closely in 2022. He is an incredibly charismatic and compelling orator. He kind of has the cadence of an Obama when he speaks. He won Pennsylvania in 22 by 15 points, which is unheard of in a swing state. Granted, he had a very, very flawed and extreme challenger on the Republican side, but he won by going into kind of Trump areas of Pennsylvania and winning over a lot of those Trump voters in the parts of Pennsylvania that Democrats normally don't campaign in. A lot of those red kind of rural counties that they kind of cede to Republicans while they focus on Philadelphia and the Philadelphia suburbs. And so if she chose Josh Shapiro, she would, I mean, obviously nothing is certain, but it would help her lock up Pennsylvania, which is a must-win state for Democrats. Democrats must win Pennsylvania in order to win the presidency. And so the combination of him being probably one of the best communicators of the Democratic message in the party and the fact that he's from a crucial swing state seems to make a lot of sense in terms of a pick, but there's a number of other names on the list as well.
Aaron, who are some of those other names that you're watching?
Yeah, I think Shapiro is certainly a top contender. The other names that I think make the most logical sense would be somebody like Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear. I think what joins all of those candidates is the idea that you are expanding the appeal of the Democratic Party. Shapiro might be the most pragmatic pick because of his electoral record, but you certainly have that with Beshear, who was just reelected in a quite red state of Kentucky in 2023. Gretchen Whitmer won by about 10 points in both of her races for governor in Michigan, which is about as important a state as Pennsylvania is. And then Mark Kelly is a guy who won Senate campaigns in another swing state in both 2020 and 2022. You know, given where Democrats are as a party right now, there is that extra premium on improving the ticket, on getting someone that is going to complement Harris. You know, Harris is a California senator. She's from San Francisco. She's going to be caricatured as a liberal. The way to do that is to bring in one of these candidates that can maybe code a little bit more conservative, not necessarily politically conservative, but code conservative when people look at them. And then the last name that I'd throw out who kind of fits that mold as well is a politician from my home state. You know, my home state's of Minnesota. Governor Tim Walz is somebody who I think has a good reputation with the National Democratic Party, comes from a more rural area of the state, and I think is somebody who is going to get a serious look along with those four names that I mentioned.
Well, before we go, we do have to talk a little bit about the GOP, and we're definitely going to get into more of where they are later in the week. So Donald Trump and J.D. Vance now have to run against a different candidate than they had planned on. And I would just imagine, you know, you're putting together a campaign, you know, you're fine-tuning everything to go after your opponent, and now they have to run against someone else. So I wonder, is this bad news for the Trump-Vance campaign?
Well, I will say that Trump, when he picked J.D. Vance, felt like he was going to win in a landslide over Biden in November. And he picked someone who was going to shore up the base. He picked someone that was very base-friendly in J.D. Vance. And now there might be some buyer's remorse because what he needs to do now is expand the base. Maybe he would have been better off picking a woman or picking someone that could appeal to those swing state suburban voters that often can decide elections in important battlegrounds. My understanding from reporters that cover Trump is that the Trump campaign is freaking out a little bit. And you can kind of tell that President Trump is freaking out if you kind of read his most recent Truth Socials over the last 24 hours.
Yeah, and actually, I want to play some tape of J.D. Vance at a rally in Ohio on Monday.
This entire system of ours is about, you got to persuade voters. You got to win their votes. You don't decide who the president is in smoke-filled rooms with billionaires and senior elected officials. You let the people decide. That's what we believe in this room, and that's what we're going to fight for, I promise you.
So I think I get this argument from J.D. Vance. I think politically speaking, the idea that Kamala Harris is somebody who was nominated by the delegates and didn't win primaries is something that maybe, voters could be made to care about. I think some of the other comments that we've seen from the likes of Trump on Truth Social and his advisor, Stephen Miller, have trended a lot more towards being like kind of apoplectic at their new reality. Like Trump is talking about the idea that the Democratic Party has committed fraud by signaling that Biden would be the nominee and then switching it. Stephen Miller was talking about how he was on Fox News on Sunday, very exasperatedly complaining about the tens of millions of dollars that the Trump campaign had spent attacking Biden, and now basically that money went to nothing.
They held a primary. People, they had ballots. They filled out circles. They went to the voting booths. They spent money on advertisements. And as President Trump said, the Republican Party spent tens of millions of dollars running against Joe Biden.
I think it's clear that the Trump campaign preferred to face Biden. Like, that's been clear for a couple of weeks now, judging by their public comments. And certainly they felt like they had a good chance against him, and now it's more unpredictable. But the thing you do when the candidate is replaced, which has been foreseeable for the last 3 weeks, is you turn to your opponent now. And they've been more focused on going after the process and going after Biden in recent days in a way that suggests they're kind of a little bit flat-footed and they don't really know what to do at this point, which is, I think, a little bit surprising given, we've been anticipating this since June 27th.
I wanted to just chime in real quick that I've been covering this democracy angle question since the debate. It was about an hour into the debate when my editors reached out and said, but if he drops out, can he? Like, what is the process for that? And we've interviewed so many election law experts that say there is nothing illegal or undemocratic about replacing Biden at the top of the ticket, particularly because he was not the nominee yet. He was not the official nominee. He was not going to be the official nominee until the delegates voted. And so it is completely...
And so there's nothing about how primary voters were thinking they were voting for Biden-Harris, not for Harris, someone else?
Well, the appearance of that is maybe not great, and that's what Republicans are going to lean in on. But a nominee is allowed to decide not to run, right? Or there's a lot of different scenarios that maybe would have caused a top of the ticket to step aside. And this might be way too in the weeds, but what voters might not realize is that when they're voting in primaries and caucuses, they're actually voting for a slate of delegates. They're not actually voting for the candidate. They're voting for delegates to go to the convention on their behalf and nominate a candidate for president. Now, those delegates have committed to kind of adhere to primary voters' wishes, although they also could change their minds. And so, again, there is nothing illegal or nothing in this process that is undemocratic. This is how it is laid out to work. And so even if Republicans are threatening litigation, they want to take this replacement ticket to the courts, and election law experts that I've talked to say that those will get thrown out immediately.
Well, I love getting a Schoolhouse Rocks master's degree education from you, Colby, on this.
And by the way, it's worth adding, like, the delegates picking the president without primary voters supporting that is how we nominated major party presidential candidates for the vast majority of this country's history. That didn't really start changing until the 1960s and 1970s. We had democracy before then. It's a different form of democracy now, but this is not delegates installing a president. This is them picking their party's nominee, and then the people, by their votes, get to render a judgment on the nominee that they've put forward.
Well, we're just going to have to leave it there. Obviously, we could talk for another 23 hours about all of this. That is it for today's episode. Thank you so much, Colby.
Thank you for having me. I love coming on.
We love having you. And thank you, Aaron. You will be back later this week.
Yep, we'll see you then. And in the meantime, make sure that you're subscribing to the Campaign Moment newsletter.
You can find a link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com. Colby Itkowitz is a politics reporter for the Democracy team covering voting and elections for the Post. And Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter.
And if you're tuning in via Post Reports, make sure that you're also following the Campaign Moment show feed itself. That's where we'll be adding extra episodes as the campaign news picks up. We had a lot of episodes last week during the Republican National Convention, and that'll surely be the case in the weeks to come. So be sure to look that up wherever you're listening.
Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Sean Carter. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy. Thanks also to Trinity Webster-Bass. I'm Elahe Izadi, and we'll see you later this week.